Hey everybody, and thank you for watching another video. My name is Merge, and welcome to the Breaking Bad What If series that I call the Heisenverse, a series where I make a change somewhere in the Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul timeline and see how that one change ripples throughout the entire universe. And in this video, we're going to answer a question that a lot of people had when watching the series for the very first time. What if Hank actually beat Jesse to death during the episode 1 minute? And I'm talking like a Sin City style beatdown. You know the one. And obviously, if we're being realistic, Hank would go to prison for, murder, but what would the fallout be from this? Because there's still Gus, Gale, and the Salamanca twins to deal with, all who were taken out by either Hank or Jesse. So I guess the real question is, how would this affect Walter White and the rest of the events of Breaking Bad? Well, that's what we're here to find out today. And before we get started, if you could leave a like on this video to support the channel, I'd appreciate it. And also, comment down below your favorite season of Breaking Bad, just so I know it's real. But with all that out of the way, let's get into it.
It's me. We need your help.
After getting a call from a random police officer that his wife's in the hospital, Hank drives away from the junkyard as fast as he can to go and see her. And as the dust begins to settle, Walter and Jesse walk out the RV. And after thanking God that their plan actually worked, they give Joe the okay to have it destroyed. And while watching the RV get turned into a cube, Walter and Jesse once again say their goodbyes and go their separate ways. But on the drive back home, Jesse calls up Skinny Pete and tells him to be on the lookout for another RV, because it's not like he doesn't have the money to get a new one. So after agreeing to find another Winnebago for their operation, Skinny Pete hangs up and Jesse pulls into his house. But while walking up to his front door and getting his keys out, he sees Hank Schrader pull up right behind his car. And when he gets out, he marches up to Jesse looking pissed. But Jesse smiles and just tells him to call his lawyer because he doesn't have anything on him. But without even skipping a step, Hank walks up to Jesse and punches him so hard in the face that it knocks him to the floor. And while pinning him to the ground, Hank yells at him while continuing to punch him. And the punches only get harder after each one. And in any ordinary case, Hank would have had some self-control. But with something like this, where someone knows his wife's name and his phone number, that just pushes him over the edge and he doesn't stop. But after several minutes of this beating, Hank's fists are now soaked with blood, and he looks down at Jesse's disfigured face and he can see that he's no longer breathing. And he now comes to the realization of what he's just done, and he's immediately filled with regret. But at the end of the day, he has to take accountability for his actions. So as he stands up in the surrounding blood, he pulls his phone out and call the cops on himself. And 64 minutes later, Hank's being fingerprinted down at the station, and he's now sitting in a cell charged for first-degree murder. And when it's time for him to call Marie from jail, it might just be one of the hardest things that he's ever had to do. But he takes the phone off the receiver and begins to dial. And when she picks up, he tells her everything that happened. And when the news of Hank's arrest makes it from Marie to Skyler and finally Walter, he almost can't believe it, seeing how he was around both of them just a few hours ago. And he'd have a hard time keeping his composure knowing that it was his actions that ruined the lives of both Hank and Jesse. And although there's nothing that can connect him to the case, Walter wears his guilt for all to see. And while it looks like he was just depressed from his brother-in-law being arrested, the only person who would have an inkling of what's going on is Skyler. But as much as she tries to call him out on it, he just denies it every time. And even when he lies to her straight to her face, the guilt that he's carrying makes it so obvious that he had something to do with it. But with everything going on with Hank right now, she would just focus on that matter first. But she does keep Walter's involvement filed somewhere in the back of her mind. So as they go and visit Marie at her house, when they get there, there's an entire news crew at her home. And in the attempt to get ahead of the story, she talks about all the good that Hank's done just this year alone. From taking down top-level drug dealers like Tuco Salamanca, and even mentioning his time working the border. And while the interview went well from their point of view, the next day, the narrative would totally change. And the media runs a story about an unhinged DEA agent that did a whole bunch of good deeds in an attempt to get away with beating someone to death. And what makes it so devastating for Marie is that she trusted her media friends to really side with Hank on this one. But instead, she's now accused of gaslighting, and her attempts of trying to clear her husband's name might have just made things worse. And speaking of worse, after a particular lawyer catches wind of the news, he'd see an opportunity not only to get some justice for Jesse, but also as a chance to, quote, stick it to the man. So after meeting with the parents of Jesse Pinkman, in an effort to gain a few more points of notoriety, Saul Goodman tells him that he's going to take the case completely pro bono. And over the next week, Hank's court battle will be happening, and Saul easily makes the case that his actions were premeditated pretty much at every turn. And even at one point comparing his temperament to someone who couldn't take a joke. And he says to the jury, "Tell me this, people of the jury, is this the kind of person that you want keeping your family safe? Someone who got tricked with a phone call, then beat the first person he can find to death? I don't think so. What about you guys?" And putting Saul's theatrics aside, he does manage to convince the jury of Hank's guilty verdict. And only after 2 hours of deliberation, Hank is sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole and only dodging the death penalty because he was a DEA agent. And in the passing days, Marie moves in with Walter and Skylar for emotional support, because since Hank was sentenced, she's become a lot more at risk, to put it lightly. And during this time, her mental state has only gotten worse since the news piece, and this causes her to have a bit of a love-hate relationship with Walter, because if he didn't bring Jesse Pinkman into their lives, none of this would have happened. But regardless of how Marie talks to him, he just takes the insults hurled at him, partially because he can't just yell back at her. And secondly, he knows that he is responsible for all of this. But his way of dealing with her is to find any excuse he can to leave the house and just visit Jesse's gravestone when he can. But on this day in particular, he'd actually be visited by Tyrus, and he tells him that he has someplace to be. And when Walter says, "Not right now," Tyrus hands him a phone, and on the other line will be Gus. And he reminds him that he's still under contract and they had an agreement for $3 million for 3 months. But not wanting to tell Gus of his and Hank's connection, he would have no valid excuse to give him. So once he gets off the phone, he heads over to the lab to once again cook with Gale. And for the next few weeks, him and Gale cook hundreds of pounds together. And even though it may seem like they're working well with each other, over time, Walter's drive to cook starts to dissipate. And already with more money than he can ever spend, he's only doing this now purely out of obligation. But he's not completely oblivious that Gale is basically training to be his replacement. Which begs the question, what happens after the 3 months are over? And with it coming up now to the midway point of the 3 months, when they do cook, Walter secretly ruins a few batches and would blame Gale for it. Because the way Walter's thinking is, he's the only one that can cook his own formula. And by him sabotaging a few batches, Gus would be forced to get rid of Gale and Walter would be all that remains. But what he doesn't realize is that after a few failed cooks, Gus would actually visit Gale at his apartment and question him about these errors. And he tells Gus, "Walter is simply brilliant, but for as much of a genius as he is, he's making a lot of rookie mistakes if you ask me." And Gus, taking that information into account, would ask Gale if he thinks he's ready to cook without Walter. And on one hand, Gale feels that he has so much that he can learn from Walter, but on the other hand, he's really tired of his superiority complex and being blamed for all these ruined cooks. So he asks Gus if he can just have one more cook with Walter just to make sure that he knows exactly what he knows. The next day rolls around and Walter once again shows up to work and he's not exactly in the best of moods, and they skip the coffee and get straight to work. But throughout the cook, Gale watches and takes notes of the process, and as Walter's about to sabotage this batch as well, Gale calls him out on it by saying, "Wouldn't the aluminum go next?" And as he points it out on his notebook, Walter, seeing that Gale is onto him, says, Of course. And he lets Gale finish the cook with him now acting as the assistant. And Walter doesn't know it yet, but that one mistake might as well have been him signing his death warrant. Because watching from the newly installed cameras would be Gus, and seeing that Walter nearly ruined a batch, he thinks for a moment before making a phone call. And he just tells the person on the other line to meet him somewhere. And 2 hours later, Gus drives out to a spot in the desert and he stands in front of the Salamanca twins. And they've been wanting their revenge for quite a while now. And with the only thing keeping them away from Walter White up until this point was Gus, that all changes now that Gale knows the recipe. And before concluding the meeting with the Salamancas, he gives them the okay to go after Walter. And from that moment on, although it hasn't been a full 3 months yet, Gus no longer cares what happens to him. And if Gus knows him how he thinks he does, then he knows that Walter still believes that he's the only person that can create his quote signature blue meth, which is honestly just pure delusion because that was disproven when he did the deal with Jesse.
His product was more or less consistent with the quality I had come to expect.
More or less?
Back over at the White residence, Walter comes through the door after a long day of cooking. And although him and Skylar aren't exactly on the best of terms, Hank being in prison might have been the best thing for them. because they're able to compartmentalize the part of their marriage where Walter lied to her about what he does for money and the part where she slept with Ted.
I fucked Ted.
Or that. But they come to a compromise and learn to live with each other while they navigate through this chapter in their life. And when Skylar tells Walter that Hank's been attacked in prison again, Walter says, "Again? That's like the 5th time this month. Jesus." And Skylar would suggest visiting Hank tomorrow to help lift his spirits. And after Walter agrees to that, both him and Skylar go to bed for the night. But just down the street, a black SUV is parked, and on the inside is the Salamanca twins watching the white residence. And for the next 6 hours, they sit in pure silence until the sun comes up. But on the inside of the white residence, now that it's the morning, everyone is getting themselves ready to drive and visit Hank. And with Walter being the last person to take a shower, while Skylar, Walter Jr., and Marie wait on him, Marie gets a phone call from the prison and she's told that Hank was stabbed during a riot and right now he's in critical condition. So instead of waiting on Walter, they just tell him to meet them there, and as they scramble to leave, they drive as fast as they can to go check on Hank. But as soon as they all leave the house, the SUV slowly pulls up to the white residence. And stepping out the vehicle wearing gray suits and black gloves is Lionel and Marco Salamanca. And after grabbing an axe out the trunk, they head inside to get their revenge. And as Walter's getting out the shower, the twins will be walking in the hallway. And as they enter the master bedroom, they are so quiet that Walter hasn't even noticed that they're right behind him. But with one mighty swing of the axe, it comes down on Walter's head, literally splitting it like a melon. And as his body falls to the floor, blood begins to soak the carpet. And while still inside the house, they both sit on his bed and recall their Uncle Hector telling him that blood was repaid with blood on this day. And after going through several dings from a bell, the phone hangs up, and as easily as they entered, they leave all the same. Over at the laundromat, Gus talks with Gale about his expectations going forward, and his new role would not only be to continue to cook Walter's formula, but also teach the other guys a part of the operation as well, like Victor, Tyrus, and even Mike. And within 3 months, everyone is able to bring in a high purity of meth. And with things with the cartel not exactly going the way he wants it, Gus decides to put a plan in motion to finally get rid of them. So while bringing Victor to Mexico, as well as a bottle of Zafiro Añejo tequila, they do Operation Bottle Popper, and things this time around go so well, Mike doesn't even get shot. Mainly because Victor's really good with the gun, and he takes out Joaquin Salamanca the moment he pokes his head out the door. And after Gus recovers from the poison, they all head back to Albuquerque. And now, with no one else standing in their way, Gustavo Fring is free to build his empire as big as it can get, even working with Lydia to move product in the Czech Republic. And in the process, they would make billions. And in the end, Gus won. But back over at the white residence, after coming back home from visiting Hank, everyone is understandably upset at Walter for not showing up to see him and even ignoring their calls for the better half of a day. And although disappearing for hours is a standard behavior from Walter, when they come home to discover what happened to him, nobody would have expected to see his lifeless body on the blood-soaked rug. And as everyone is screaming out in horror, once again the police are called to deal with another murder connected to the Schrader White family. And after giving a statement, then taking Walter's body away, Junior sits in Holly's room and just wants to be alone for a while. But when Skylar yells that it's time for him to leave, he drops one of his crutches on a diaper box by accident. And when he sees something unusual in it, he opens the box and sees thousands of dollars stacked inside. And unable to process what he's looking at, he calls out for his mom saying, "Mom! I think I know what happened to Dad!" Hey everybody, and thank you so much for watching this video, and I really hope you enjoyed another story from the Heisenverse. And if this video proves anything, it's that Jesse is truly an essential element to the Breaking Bad TV series. No pun intended. Because without him, Walter truly has no backup, and when he lets his ego get in the way of actual business, he learns very quickly how replaceable he actually is. And as far as the ending goes for this story, I would like to think that there's a sequel here somewhere, but there's not a whole lot that can be done now that everyone's either dead or in jail except for Gus. But who knows, maybe I'll think of something, but that's just me. But now I want to hear from you guys. What did you think of this story? Did you like it? Is there anything that you'd change? And would you like to see a continuation to it? Whatever it is, let me know down below in the comments and I'll do my best to respond. Until then, my name is Merge. Later.